Shall we? Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this event. I think everyone is concerned and worried about the conflict that is happening now in a Holy Land, and we have a lot of questions. Every one of us, I'm sure, has a lot of questions. So as you realize, the English is not my first language, so forgive me if I make mistakes. I want to tell just very shortly about myself and Jewish History Keepers Foundation. So I was born in Russia and immigrated to Israel, lived there for 6 years, came here, and I started my journey to the Judaism really very recently, around 2.5 years ago. I was very lucky to re-establish connection to my dear friend and my teacher, Rabbi and he introduced me to my another great mentor and teacher, Rabbi Kalman Worch. And since I think we were studying for 1.5 years, approximately, maybe 2 years. And every lesson for me is a blessing, and I'm really grateful for Hashem that he connected me to the great people that I can learn so much from. So I also established Jewish History Keepers Foundation to disseminate the ideas, to disseminate the knowledge about the Jewish history and Jewish values, and let people know about us. It's not, we are not going to convert anyone to Judaism or force our ideas on everyone, but we just want to share information, because I think that that's, and answer questions if we have one, and know where to go with these questions if we have them. So with that, let me introduce with a great joy and delight Rabbi Kalman Worch. Go ahead. Thank you. And sorry, before we continue, few technical things regarding the Zoom meeting. I kindly ask to switch off your video if you're not talking. So we will have a lecture, approximately half an hour, and then Q&A. So during Q&A, you can ask questions, over video, in a chat, in Russian and English, in Hebrew, in Spanish, whatever language you want to ask those questions. And I'll translate from Russian and Hebrew. I'm sure Rabbi Kalman Worch doesn't need a translation. So that's first thing. And regarding the video, yeah, when you talk, you can switch it on, but for the reason of the bandwidth, and sometimes Zoom really doesn't like a lot of videos streaming at the same time, you'll just switch it on. So I will mute everyone, and when you want to ask a question, raise your hand or put it in a chat window. So with that, Rabbi, floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining. So basically, what I think we're going to do here is I'm gonna speak on the issue at hand, which we'll explain in a minute, for about a half hour, and then we will open up the floor to questions. The topic for today is the conflict in the land of Israel, and where it is and what its trajectory is. That's really the point of our discussion today. But there are many elements of this discussion, and I'm hoping that with my outline that some of us will gain a better understanding of the situation and the history behind it. And I think that's part of the problem, is that today a lot of people get their information from a book they read, an article they read, a story someone tells them. There isn't really a process by which the world can learn the truth on these subjects, especially since a lot of the story of Eretz Yisrael kind of doesn't go along with the story that the world tells in some ways. And so because of that, historians are supposed to be telling us history, but sometimes things come out the way people want to present it. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to present the story and the history of the land of Israel as it leads into the current conflict today. And what I would recommend for you, I know there's going to be a lot of questions. It's actually difficult to listen to a lecture while you're thinking of the questions you want to ask. And since we're going to sort of do more of the questions at the end, what I recommend is if you have a question, write it down and then move on, and then come back to it when the time for questions comes. All right, so let's begin. The Jewish people, we're going to follow along the outline, as you can see from the flyer that Rabbi Avraham was so kind to create for us, and we're grateful to the Jewish History Keepers for putting this together. So let's begin. Number one, why do the Jewish people consider Israel their home? And the second question we're going to answer is, what is the history of the land of Israel? So here is a very long answer to both of these questions. We believe that the land of Israel is the land from which God placed made this area in the world as the place for the Jewish people. How did this happen? So what our tradition teaches us. Now, some of this can be backed up by archaeology, some of the history of the Jewish people. Some of this is our tradition. As far as I'm concerned, our tradition is just as reliable and even more reliable, obviously, than historical evidence. But nevertheless, I'm going to point out where it's a matter of history and where it's a matter of our tradition. So we go back all the way back in time to the founder, the first Jew, Avraham Avinu, Abraham. Abraham was told by God, go to the land that I will show you. He comes to Israel, and God promises him this land to give to his children. But the Jewish people don't have the land yet. It's not given for Abraham to take control of, but he is promised the land, as we find multiple times in the Torah, that God promises Abraham to give to his children the land of Israel. However, living at that time in the land are pagans, Canaanites. These are the children, the descendants of Canaan, who, along with all the other people in the world, were idol worshippers, were people who had no knowledge of God. They were living in the land, as well as a nation that may sound very familiar to some of you, the Philistines, known in Hebrew as the Pelishtim, the Philistines. They also were living in the land. They were cousins of the Canaanites, who were these pagan, ancient, barbaric nation that practiced human sacrifice and all kinds of other horrible things. God says to Abraham, I'm going to give the land to your descendants, but not directly to his descendants. As you know, we all did this at the last Pesach Seder. God sent the Jewish people down to Egypt, and we came out of Egypt and we arrived in the land of Israel. This was something, if you read the Torah, you realize that the land of Israel is not just important to us, but is an essential part of who we are. Until the Jewish people arrive in the land, we don't fully have the Torah. If you look over and over in the Torah, it says, when you will arrive in the land, when you will be in the land, these are the commandments you will keep. And if you keep the commandments, you will stay in the land. If you don't keep the commandments, you will be thrown out of the land. But I want to make one more point. We have the Torah, which was given, in our tradition by God to Moshe. But we know, everyone knows, that the Torah consists of, the primary element of the Torah, consists of the 5 books of Moses. Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim, and Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, etc. The greatest commentator on the Torah of the last 1,000 years was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, known by everyone as Rashi. Rashi's first comment on the Torah is the Torah is supposed to be a book of laws. Why is the entire first book of the Torah, the entire book of Genesis, stories? Why is a religion, the first fifth, instead of being the rules and regulations, are the stories of the ancestors of the religion? That's Rashi's question. Stories, maybe save stories for the end. So Rashi answers, because you cannot connect to the Torah in a real way unless you have the land of Israel. Says Rashi, and I quote this because you won't believe that someone wrote this 1,000 years ago. Rashi lived from 1040 to 1105, so almost 1,000 years ago. Says Rashi, the Torah should not have started from creation. The Torah should have started from the laws. I'm quoting here. Why does it start from creation? Because in the future, the nations of the world will say, you Jews are robbers. You conquered the land of these nations. And who gave you the right to do so? So we say to them, here's our story. This is our right. Our tradition tells us that God instructed us that this is the land that He's given to us. He gave it to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And that's our land. And so we did. We arrived in the land. And at this point, you don't need our tradition. At this point, we have archaeological evidence. We have coins, we have shards of clay. It's very interesting to me that like we have entire books that describe what life looked like in Israel in those days. And people go, oh, those are Bible books. We don't believe that. But they find in the trash a little shard of clay that says on it this, that someone threw out their window, 2,000 years ago. And they look, we found this archaeological evidence. But nevertheless, we have all this evidence that we were living in the land in the days of Yehoshua and who brought us into the land, in the days of the judges. And not only that, but the Torah and the prophets, which describes our living in the land, is constantly backed up by archaeological evidence. And this isn't really my topic, but just to kind of make the point, there was a certain tunnel that's described in the Book of Kings, that Chizkiyahu the king dug himself a tunnel. And for 1,000 years, people were using this as evidence that the Bible is made up. Because here you have someone, a king, who's supposed to have made a tunnel, and there was no technology in those days to create such a tunnel. And therefore, the Bible must be made up. That's what they said. Then 100 years ago, they ran into a big problem because they found this actual tunnel. They found the tunnel as it's described in the prophets. And then they go, okay, well, maybe they did, but I didn't see any of the apology letters coming from all the Bible critics for mocking, this, and even though they turned out to be. Anyway, but the point is, we have evidence, we have tunnels, we have, the good kind of tunnels. We have proof that we were there in the land, and unfortunately, we were then driven from the land. And our tradition tells us that it's because we weren't, doing all the right things in the land. We were driven from the land for about 70 years. And then Ezra brought the Jewish people back after 70 years of exile. And we came back into the land. And then the Persians were in control. So even though we were living in the land, we were living under the Persian rule because we were part of the Persian Empire. And this is kind of the point I want to make. When the Jews arrive in Israel the first time, the Jews have dominion. We have absolute control over the land. And we would have this dominion control over the land, give or take on and off with some major or minor disputes for about 900 years, almost 1,000 years. Starting from when we first arrived, there were enemies who took over, but essentially we were the primary controllers of the land for almost 1,000 years. The Assyrians came in, the Samaritans came in, all these other groups, but we were really in charge of the land. And then we left for 70 years, we went into exile, then we came back and we lived in the land for another more than 400 years. And this time it was under Persians. And even when the Greeks defeated the Persians, we, the Jews, remained in the land of Israel, and we were now under Greek control. This, of course, is the setting for the story of Hanukkah, because we didn't like the fact that the Greeks were ruling over us. And so these band of Jews, small little band of Jews, started a rebellion against the mightiest nation that the world had seen. And we drove off the Greeks. It was incredible. And then we had autonomy. We ruled the country as the Hashmonai kings. And that was until the Romans took over. When the Romans took over, first they ruled the land from afar, but then the Jews kept rebelling against Rome because it's very hard to govern a nation of Jews. And so the Romans drove us from the land in the first century. And that's where our modern story begins. because starting in the first century, the Jews basically start slowly to move in throughout the world to be dispersed. The Romans were slowly pushing us out of the land, making it impossible for us to live there. But the land itself was under Roman rule and would remain a sort of Christian Roman rule when Rome became a Christian nation until Muhammad came along. When Muhammad came along, he conquered the Middle East, and the land of Israel fell under Arabic control. The Christians, being upset by this, 400 years later, Pope Urban II in the year 1095 starts the Crusades, a mission by the Christians to recapture the Holy Land, Eretz Yisrael, from the Muslims. And this war would go on for 200 years, and essentially the Muslims would win. They would win because they would overcome, even though for a while it was Christian and it was Muslim, and it was going back and forth, but the Jews had no power over the land. We were driven from the land, we had no control, we had no place for safety, and we were spread already throughout the world. And at this point, there's very few Jews in the land of Israel. When Nachmanides, when the Ramban arrives in the 13th century, he would say that he couldn't even find 10 Jews to pray with in Yerushalayim. This continued, and Eretz Yisrael moved into the domain of the Ottoman Empire and it stayed like this until about 1492. 1492, when the Jews are driven from Spain, thousands and thousands of those Jews went to Israel and started repopulating the land. And you should know that when they did this, there is no record whatsoever of anyone saying, "You are coming unto our land." This was a land that was ruled by the Ottomans. There was plenty of open space. They were in charge, and if the Jews wanted to come and pay taxes and pay tribute, then that was fine with them. And this would remain under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. You can even see today in Yerushalayim, the walls of Yerushalayim, the ones that were put up by Suleiman the Magnificent. I didn't name him the Magnificent. He probably named himself. But Suleiman the Magnificent, he made those walls that we see today in Yerushalayim, as part of his rule of the Ottoman Empire. And then eventually the Ottoman Empire would lose to the British. And then the British were in charge of this area. Now, at this time, while all this is happening, at the same time, anti-Semitism in Europe is getting way, way out of hand. I mean, anti-Semitism in Europe goes all the way back to the Crusades. Back in 1095, when the Crusaders went through all the European cities and basically massacred Jews in the same way that Hamas massacred Jews just a few weeks ago. May God blot out their name and avenge the blood of those victims. But it was the same thing. They came through cities and they killed all the Jews they could. And this would happen again. The Jews were expelled from this country and from that country, and there were massacres and murders all over the place. In let's go with 1648. In 1648, Khmelnytsky, the founder of Ukraine, who is there's a statue of him, statues of him all over Ukraine. Khmelnytsky, he invaded Poland with all of his Cossacks, and there's different opinions as to how many Jews he killed, but he made it part of his mission: 100,000 Jews, 200,000 Jews. There's different historical opinions, and then the pogroms in Russia, and then finally the Holocaust. But it was even earlier. It was back in the Dreyfus affair. I don't want to go too much into the history of more modern history. I think people can look this up themselves. But in the modern history, it was Herzl was moved by the Dreyfus affair. Most Jews were moved by the Holocaust. But essentially, even though the Jews were living in exile, we don't have a land. There was this consensus amongst the Jews that the only way that you can keep the Jewish people safe is if they have their own land. So the Jews went first to the British and eventually to the United Nations and said, look, the Holocaust happened. We need a place where Jews can live and be safe, where Jews can take care of themselves. Because you know what? That's kind of what Herzl was saying when you saw the Dreyfus affair, where they accused this Jew of committing a crime he didn't do. And he said, it's going to happen when you have someone who's a stranger in your land. You're always going to turn that person into the victim. That person is always going to be a scapegoat. The only way the Jews can be safe is if they're not strangers. They have to have their own land. And that essentially is how the modern state of Israel came to be from a very technical perspective. We're going to get a little bit into the religious element of it, but I know I've got a lot to cover in a little bit of time. But essentially, let me answer the three questions again. Why did the Jewish people consider Israel their home? It's because our tradition tells us that we've been living there for thousands of years, and archaeology tells us that we've been living there for thousands of years, and we haven't just randomly been living there. It is the land where all of our story, where our history took place, and we have deeper roots in the land of Israel. Let me say this very clearly. We have deeper roots in the land of Israel than any nation in the world today has roots in their nation. There is no other nation today that's as deeply rooted. And what's incredible is that we're still keeping the same Torah, the same traditions. Maybe gefilte fish has been introduced since then, and some shlishkas and chalapchas and some other dishes, but essentially it's the same Judaism as 3,500 years ago. The second point of our discussion is, okay, so what's the Arabic perspective? Right? So the Arabs also have a tradition that takes them way, way, way back. Abraham has two sons. One is Yitzchak, who God says, that's the son who I'm going to give the land to. And the other son is Ishmael, whom God says, send him away. He's not going to be part of this inheritance. He will be a great nation, God promises Abraham. He will be a great nation, and he will be powerful and all those things. But he's really going to like to shoot arrows. It says that in the Torah, that he really likes to shoot arrows. Today it's missiles, but it's the same idea. But they also have their roots there, the Ishmaelites, but they have no claim to the land. They have no appearance in the land. The closest thing we have to Ishmaelites in the land of Israel is when the brothers sell Joseph down into slavery. It's they see a band of Ishmaelites going down to Egypt, so they sell him that way. That's about all you have in terms of Ishmaelites in the land, and that would continue incredibly until Muhammad. That's a very long time. It's a very long time, and for when you go back to Avraham, 3,500 years ago, and we're saying maybe 1,500 years ago, we're saying almost a millennia and a half where there's no Ishmaelites in the land of Israel. But then Muhammad comes along and conquers the Middle East, and basically the Muslims are living in the land like they're living in anywhere in the Middle East. They don't necessarily have a claim. Now, there is one point, which is that there's the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock, which was built in the 7th century, right? That's very, very new. If you want to understand how new the Dome of the Rock is, it was built on the rubble of our second temple, meaning we had a temple that stood for 410 years, and we had a temple that stood for 420 years. So after our second temple was in rubble for 500 years, they built a dome on top of it, which is a really, could you imagine if someone went to St. Peter's Cathedral and knocked it down and put up I don't know, a house of Scientology. I mean, that's kind of what the way we see this, like Dome on the Rock. But that's when they did appear, when Muhammad basically took over the Middle East in the 7th century, and they were living there. Okay, now here, I'm going to try to present this in a fair way, because I think we have to understand what's happening here. As far as these Arabs are concerned, they were living in the land under Ottoman rule, and under Ottoman rule, basically, they're the people. This is their land. Now, the Ottomans lost to the British, and the British took over the land, and at that point, it belonged to nobody. And in the same way that the British carved up Africa, and the British, the French, the Dutch, all of them, they carved up Africa, and they drew lines based on how they thought they should divide it up. We all know stories where they sometimes drew the line in the middle of a tribe, and those tribal members were no longer able to contact each other because this is where the line was drawn. Those same people drew lines and gave the Jews the land of Israel from, again, the United Nations made this. Now, I want to stay away from the religious discussion. At this point, we'll get to the religious discussion in a little bit. What I'm saying is, in terms of the Muslim argument, their argument isn't a religious one. They're not claiming that God gave them the land. I mean, there are individuals who claim that, but essentially, it's not their argument. What they're arguing is, you were kicked out of the land. We came here, and now who are you to ask for your land back? And again, if we're just going to speak without the religious element, it sounds like a decent argument, except that the Jews' response to them is, we are Jews, and this is our land, and we have nowhere else to go. Meaning, this is our homeland, this is our ancestorship, and we are asking the world to give us land. You want land? Ask the United Nations, they'll give you land too. What do you want from us? So to which the Muslims respond with, well, that doesn't mean we have to want to give up our land. And that creates a dispute. And this is the reason why there cannot be peace. This is the reason why there cannot be peace, or I shouldn't say there cannot be peace, why there hasn't been peace. The reason why there hasn't been peace is because as far as these Arabs are concerned, they were living here and the world ganged up on them and threw them out of their home. And which means they want the entire land back. Now, I don't agree with their argument, but I'm trying to present this in a fair way. That's what they're arguing. The reason why I think they're wrong is because that's not how the world works. Again, before we get to the religious element, just from a geopolitical perspective, I mean, what would happen if some tribe in the middle of Africa said, "No, we want you to reshape the redraw the lines of the nations"? It doesn't really work that way. But on a deeper level, there's a religious element to this as well. And I'm going to try to do this quickly because I'm running out of time on the lecture element. In the Torah, it says, and you can Google this if any of you want to, in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 3, it says that you, the Jewish people, are going to be thrown out of your land. And you're going to be there for a long time. And then, and I'll read the words in Hebrew, V'shav Hashem Elokecha et shivutcha v'richamecha. God will find mercy and will bring you back to the land. It says here. Now, it has never happened in the history of the world that any nation should be driven from their land and taken to exile and then to return to that land. And for the Torah to claim that that's going to happen is a pretty bold move, because you can see that everyone 500 years ago was pointing to this and saying, we don't even see how that's possible. And yet today, so many Jews, almost half the Jews, are living in the land of Israel. This is the technical elements of the dispute, for which we believe that it's our home, and it's been our home for thousands of years. We have spiritual evidence, we have physical evidence, and of course, like we're saying, if you believe in God, then you believe in the Torah, which the Muslims do. It says there that the land is ours. If you don't want to follow God, and you want to follow the laws of the nations of the world, it's actually even more obvious that the land belongs to the Jews, because the land was given to the Jews. Now, the problem is, one may argue that the Jews now have more land than was given to them in 1948. So for this, we have to remember one very important point, and this is part of what we're getting into in the last section, is that the dispute, there cannot really be diplomacy when the land of Israel was declared a nation by the United Nations in 1948. The neighbors of Eretz Yisrael didn't celebrate, didn't go, oh shucks, the Jews got their country. They invaded. They raised armies, multiple armies, and they invaded. Somehow, call it a miracle, call it whatever you want, the Jews won. So in 1967, they came back. And this time, Egypt, Jordan, everyone attacked again, and the Jews won. And so what they did was they then moved into those lands and occupied the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, they went into all these places and they took all this land. And you know what? The Egyptians said, we're just a country of people. We don't want to fight all day. You know what? We won't bother you. So the Jews said, okay, well, here's Sinai Peninsula back, so you won't bother us. Right? What the idea here is, and this is why there's a problem with peace through diplomacy, as long as there is the level of hatred and animosity that we already knew was there, but that the world just came to realize, they didn't just invade with soldiers and kill people. They came through and they massacred and they plundered. The things they did, we can't even speak. And they say that things are a lot worse than what we've been told. We can't handle all the information. When they're educating their children to be warriors and fighters, there isn't really room for peace, because you can't live. The Talmud has a beautiful expression: you can't share a basket with a snake. You can't live in proximity of a neighbor who just wants to murder you, and not just murder you. If it was up to them, and if you doubt me, go see what happened. If it was up to them, they would drive through the land of Israel and kill, 8 million Jews, whatever are there, but not one by one in the most horrendous way they could. And so there have been attempts for peace. And those attempts at peace come from the more mild element of the Palestinian people but nevertheless, the anger and the rage and the hatred continues to have control of the situation. And that's why there really doesn't feel like there's a possibility for peace in a natural way, which is why the Jews believe that something supernatural has to happen. An individual, a person, a leader, a king-like individual, someone who will somehow overcome all of these. That's what we mean when the Jews say they're hoping for the Messiah, for the coming of Mashiach. It's not some deity-like element that some of the other religions have. For us, we believe it's just a leader who's somehow going to breach the minds, or in one way or another, and bring peace into the world. What we believe is that human beings aren't really capable of creating a perfect world. We need divine support in order to accomplish that. And in order for that to happen, we, the Jewish people, have to be our best and influence the world to become its best. And it is only through that process that the world will become a better place. And somehow, now, how do we influence the Muslims? It's not like that. What we need to do is find a way each person has to better themselves and make the world a better place. So now, what do we do in the meanwhile? What do we do in the interim? So that's part of this dispute. How do you handle a situation where the Jews would be happy, if history says anything, for the Muslims to have their section of land and to just leave the Jews alone? But that doesn't seem to be what they're wanting. And so giving them less than what they want doesn't satisfy them. They want more. And this leads to the great conflict in the Middle East. I feel like I've oversimplified a lot of these elements, but I think that's a fair general outline of the Jewish perspective of the story of the land and how the conflict came to be. And what I would like for you now is to sort of bring up any questions. And what I will say is there are no questions that are off limits. Every question is okay, but we do have to sometimes find better ways of phrasing them. So with that, I'm going to turn the video back over to you.
Thank you very much for the great lecture. So with that, we're opening the Q&A. And as Rabbi says, you can ask any question. If you want to ask it and switch on your video, that's fine. So raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Also, I would ask to be civil and try to not to ask questions in a way that can, that can be perceived as overboard, but any questions is good. And also you can put the question in chat. So, and let me start with the first questions. So Rabbi, we had a lot of discussions regarding that with friends and family. And I just want to, I have many questions, but kind of a big question is that our Jewish tradition is saying that real Israel or real state of Israel will come when Mashiach comes. But Israel was created by the group of the Zionists that really had nothing to do with religion. You know, they didn't want to like bring any religious element into Israel, and it was actually anti-religion state. So how we can reconcile it, and going forward, how should we view Israel as our homeland, as a religious country that follow Jewish laws and kind of trying to, you know, establish Jewish state, or we should look at it as a France, Switzerland, Thailand, or any other country on the earth?
Yeah, I understand the question. It's not an easy question to answer, but I'm going to give it a shot. The view, in terms from a religious perspective, from about the modern state of Israel, ranges from anywhere to from the religious extreme of the religious Zionists, who believe that this is the prophecy that God said that the Jews would return to the land, and they believe that this is the beginnings of the great redemption of the Jewish people. And this goes all the way to the other end of people who believe that there is no religious land of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, this is not currently a government of God, but rather it's just a place where Jews get to make the rules and protect themselves and not be subject to the protection of someone else's kindness. So according to them, this state is here not necessarily for any religious purpose or for any religious fulfillment, but simply the Jews have a right to live like every other nation in autonomy and in their own safety and security. Now, these two extremes, there's all the steps in between, but all of these Jews agree that there is supposed to be Jews living in the modern state of Israel run by Jews. There are some Jews who believe that we would be better off if there was no state, but we're not discussing that particular philosophy tonight. We're staying within the groups that believe that the modern state of Israel is a positive thing. That's what I'm saying. It goes anywhere from it's just a place where Jews can live safely, all the way to the other extreme, where some people feel that this is like the fulfillment of the biblical prophecies. And a Jew can stand in between anywhere on that range and still be someone who recognizes the modern state of Israel. I'm not directly answering your question, but I think I am. Okay, I want to answer a couple of questions I see in the chat, if I may. The first, maybe if someone can help me with the questions. Okay, I see the first one. Do today's Palestinians have any connections to the groups mentioned in the Torah, the Canaanites, the Plishtim, the Ishmaelim? This is a very good question, because if you ask the Palestinians, who are your ancestors? They will tell you the Ishmaelites, the Yishmael, the character who is the son of Avraham. The problem is that if that was true, if they do say that that's true, they're essentially saying they have no right to the land. Because in the Bible, and they also believe in the Torah, it says that Abraham says, you know, we're going to have the land, it's going to be shared between Isaac and Ishmael, and that was his plan. And Sarah, his wife, says to him, no, this is only for Isaac. They go to God, and God says, no, Ishmael will be a great nation, but elsewhere. He can go to Egypt, he can go all these other places, but not in this land. So if they're claiming to be descendants of those Ishmaelites, it's not a good argument for them. Now, if they're claiming to be descendants of the Philistines, the Pelishtim, who lived in Gaza, So I don't know what the guys on the West Bank would do, but if they claim to be the spiritual descendants of the Philistines, then they're in even bigger trouble because the Philistines were nothing but bad guys, right? If you read the story, they were just terrible people who kept attacking the Jews and all the time, and eventually they were driven from the land, and they never had any spiritual right to the land anyway. And even if they did, it was in those small sections in the south of the land. So they're certainly not physical descendants, but even if they're spiritual descendants, it doesn't really help their argument. There's also a question here: how many of them moved in from other Arab countries to boost the local Arab population? So this is a really complicated question, because what happens is you don't have any information. If someone were to ask you how many Palestinians were there in the land of Israel in 1948, well, technically the answer would be none, because they didn't start calling themselves Palestinians until much later, when they were trying to organize a theory for why they should be entitled to land. They never used. I mean, you find anywhere in history where these Muslims call themselves Palestinians, you won't find it. I can find you places where we call ourselves Jews millennia ago, but there's no place where they refer to themselves. This is sort of a new term, and that's part of the problem, that many of these ideas are new ideas. Yeah, recently someone told me, they said, the reason why the Palestinians are so angry is because the Jews have been terrorizing them for 70 years. That's what he said to me. I said, really? The Jews have been terrorizing Palestinians for 70 years. Here's your first clue that they're lying. Any nation in history, any nation in the world that claims that its story is only 70 years old is lying to you. There is no story of any nation that's 70 years old. There can be a modern nation that its newest version is 70 years old. But what happened before 70 years? And what happened before 1948? Do you know that in 1929, Palestinians massacred Jews in Hebron? If you go to Hebron today, you can visit the site of that massacre. That's 1929. What were the Jews doing to you then? Right? The whole thing. So in terms of where these Palestinians come from, why weren't they taken in by other nations? Like, what is going on? How come the Ukrainians were attacked by Russia? Whatever. Let's not get into the politics, right? What did Israel do? Sent a bunch of planes and scooped up all its Jews and took them to Israel, right? Everyone knows this. So if the Israelis are dropping bombs on Gaza, why aren't their brothers scooping them up? No one's taking them. No one's opening a door. What is going on, right? These stories are such difficult stories. Okay, let me turn it over back to questions before I go back to the chat. Any further points or questions? Okay, let me go to the chat here. Please feel free to just put the question in the chat. The question is on the chat: do you foresee anti-Semitism getting much worse in the US? How do we feel safe right now? Because this is a very difficult question. The situation in the United States is a little tricky. What happened was, let me start from a different angle. I'm going to start from a different angle. If you have it with you, otherwise you can Google. Turn to the book of Esther. If you have a book of Esther, turn to the book of Esther and turn to chapter 3 in the book of Esther. Chapter 3 in the book of Esther tells us that there was a man called Haman, who became the biggest man in the land of Persia. And the king made a rule that when he walks by, everyone has to bow down to him. And look at verse 2. All the servants of the king are bowing down to Haman, but Mordechai the Jew doesn't bow down. So look at verse 5 and 6. Haman saw that Mordechai was not bowing to him, and so Haman became angry, and he wished to kill Mordechai. But then he found out Mordechai was a Jew. So he said, we have to kill all the Jews. That's what it says here. This is 2,000 years ago. more than 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. In our book, it tells a story about the greatest anti-Semite of the generation who wanted to wipe out every Jew in the world. Why? Because the king told all the people to bow down to him. And there was one Jew who didn't bow down to him. So because one Jew didn't bow down to him, he was going to kill him. But then he found out he was a Jew. So what do you have to do? Kill all the Jews. And the question is, this is a smart guy. He's now the most powerful man in the land. He's not an idiot. So where's the logic? What's the logic? The answer is like this. Anti-Semites hate Jews, and they hate Jews deeply. And we believe that it's a natural phenomenon in the world. And I don't want to get into the roots of it. It has to do with our spiritual being and all of that. What an anti-Semite needs is some excuse. And so they created the blood libel. I don't know if you're familiar with Jewish history, but the blood libels where they accused us of drinking Gentile blood. We don't even drink cow's blood, right? All our meat is too salty because blood is prohibited to us, right? That's kosher meat is overly salted, right? So it's a silly idea, but you need an idea. When the Holocaust happened, it was very difficult for a person to express their anti-Semitism. It was so difficult that some of our biggest enemies said, fine, take a country. Then within a few years, they were like, what did we do? How were we so nice to the Jews? And essentially, for the last 30 years, the United Nations has been one big giant nation, one big giant organization to fight against Israel. That's all they do, is they don't care if there's genocide happening all over the world. So what I'm saying is that anti-Semitism is there in the United States of America because there are bad people who hate Jews. They need some story. They need some story. And so the Palestinian cause became the favorite of the anti-Semites because it now gave them an opportunity to speak negatively about Jews. So every time there was a little incident or anything, they've turned that, and they've been doing this for 50 years. And really, us Jews, we've done nothing about it. And on American college campuses has been teaching anti-Jewish teachings for decades. And we said, what's going to come from it? We didn't do anything about it. Suddenly, we wake up and we go, wait, this is what they're teaching? Yeah, this is what they've been teaching for decades. That's why there's so much anti-Semitism, because we have usually, it's actually the most intelligent thinkers in the world who are usually the deepest anti-Semites, ironically, how that works. But unfortunately, that's growing in the United States. Now, what's the solution to it? Is it going to get worse? It will get worse unless we have a solution. Now, we believe that there are three possible solutions in our tradition. The first solution is that all the Jews are taken by Mashiach to the land of Israel, and we don't care if they hate us, right? They hate us from afar. The other option is that we, the Jews, connect to God more, and then we will be saved from anti-Semitism. And the third option that we believe is if we, the Jewish people, can unite. When we love each other, it has such a powerful effect that it causes even strangers and outsiders to love us more. That's from our traditional perspective, the only way to fix it. But from a thing, I know we got 300,000 Jews in Washington, but I don't see anyone going, oh, the Jews got 300,000 Jews in Washington. I don't hate them anymore. You know, there was a book written by Mark Twain called On the Jews. A lot of people are familiar with the last article in it, where he talks about the Jews and how somehow they survived. But originally, this book, written by Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, right, I don't say the greatest American author, the second greatest American author after Edgar Allan Poe. So Mark Twain was sent by an American lawyer a question. The question is, I hate the Jews, and I don't know why. Can you please, Mr. Clemens, explain to me why I hate the Jews? So Mark Twain goes on a very long discussion about why he thinks anti-Semitism is there. I don't want to get into his words, but just the idea that there's some lawyer American lawyer in the 19th century who's looking at himself and going, I don't like these Jews, but I can't in the world figure out why. And we believe that exists out there in the world, and we have to do things. I see someone put in the question, whether education can change things. I don't think, number one, that we'll ever have a platform where the world will listen to what we have to say. And number two, I don't think education can stop anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism can only come from, again, this is our tradition, can only be fixed when we fix ourselves and come together. Again, this is the Hasidic tradition that when the Jews get along, then if the Jews can get along, then the nations of the world will not feel that same level of hatred towards us. I want to go back to a question someone else put up before. I learned many years ago that Muslims, their tradition believes it was Yishmael taken up the mountain. Yeah, so in terms of Yishmael being the one on the mountain who Abraham took, all of that, essentially there are some Muslim traditions that try to give them greater credibility and connection with, in terms of their connection with the land. But those are sort of stories that were developed later in order to go back. But if in the Quran, for example, it's not there. This isn't what's in the Quran, that they have the right to the land. And so these are sort of things, again, people do that all the time. When if I'm living somewhere, I can write whatever story I want. Whoever wants to write, you could sit down right now and write a history of your people. If people like it, they'll accept it and they'll read it. Yeah, you're making a fair point. Again, I bring up this point in the chat, which is that basically non-Jews know very little about Jews. I mean, I just gave a half-hour synopsis of the history of the land. And for most people, this would have been shockingly unfamiliar information. And I think you're right that there needs to be a greater way of teaching this. But I think that without, let me say this differently. I'm going to say this a little differently. I think every person here, for sure, everyone here that I see, if I was to ask you, how do you think about this? How about everyone just put down their guns? Everyone put down their swords. Everyone put down their arrows and their missiles. Everyone just put down your weapons. Stop fighting right now and just stay where you are. I think most of us would be okay with that. Right? But there's a lot of people in the world who wouldn't. There's a lot of people in the world who aren't where we are, which is to just want to live every day. And the truth is, I would say this, I want to make this very clear to everyone. Most Palestinians just want to go home from a long day of work and eat dinner with their family and watch the nightly news and go to sleep. Most Palestinians don't spend their day thinking about how they can go to war. But those people are not in charge. Those people are not running things. Those people are not the people who are making decisions. And unfortunately, all over the world, there are people who have desire for power or whatever it is that they want. And so in terms of educating those people, there's no education for that. What needs to happen is the entire world needs to wake up. All of humanity needs to go, why in the world are we fighting? What are we doing? No one has to die. For what? For an extra square piece of land? Like, what are you doing? Why would you murder someone? Why would you do that to your soul? And that kind of perspective, which is what we all want when we say we want world peace, we believe that the only way that can come about is with something greater than what humanity has at its disposal right now. Something bigger has to come along. Something or someone who can actually wake up humanity. And without that, what we're hoping for is at best that the people who want peace should retain control and hold back the people who want to fight and who want wars. Okay. All right. Any further questions or points?
Yeah, there is another question about land for peace. It's in the chat. Could you please review the religious implications of land for peace schemes? How does the Torah suggest Hashem would view that kind of
Okay, yeah. So
approach?
would Jews trade land for peace? So this goes back to what you were brought up before, which is how do you view the status of the land of Israel? If you believe that there's no religious state, it's just a place where Jews can live safely, then if that's the case, then figure out what's the safest way for Jews to live. And so if that's all it's about, then you live in this land, and we'll live in this land, and you won't bother us, and we won't bother you. In theory, at least, there's room for talk about land for peace. But if you learn that the creation of the modern state of Israel is part of the Jewish right to the land, and that we're entitled to ownership of the entire land, then giving away land for what turns out to be false promises of peace is itself doing a wrong thing for the hopes that something good will come of it. And so far, the history hasn't told us that that's been a very successful bringing about of peace, because even when you give land, it seems like people aren't really satisfied with what's there.
Well, the next one is probably more statement than question. Says, I read that Palestinian elite men are allowed up to 4 wives, okay, whereas ordinary Palestinian men do not have even 1 wife, thus making this man into maniacs. It was suggested that this law be repealed so that any man can have a wife. I guess not. It's not up to us.
Right. So I'd say like this, we don't want to make judgments about other people's cultures, because I think within every culture, you have something that some other culture is going to say that's weird, right? So in terms of the law itself, I think we can have a separate discussion on the concepts of marriage and man and woman and what those roles in the world would be, and it may even be more controversial than this subject, right? These days. But I think the bigger point you're making from this question, which is that you're living in a society that doesn't have the moral ideals that you have. If you have a society where people are raised that the greatest accomplishment is how much money you have, that's a society. And next door, they have a country where the greatest accomplishments is how many children you have. Okay, that's it. And then next to it, you have another country where their greatest accomplishment is how many people you've murdered. And in that country, it's a sense of pride. Every person has a stripes on their sleeve for every person that they've killed. These are not cultures that you can then say, hey, let's all live in harmony. Right? Because in this one culture, they're trying to kill as many people as they can, and the other one, they're trying to make as much money as they can. You can't put that together. And if you have I'm using extremes, but the point you're making, which is that when you've got a society that doesn't really have this kind of moral code, such as treating women nicely, which is something that amazingly took mankind thousands of years to figure out, that just because women are naturally born with a weaker frame doesn't mean that the man should take advantage of that, right? That's an idea that existed in Judaism early, but the rest of the world, it took some time for them to learn this. Okay, so the world figured it out at some point, but the world is trying to grow. Everyone's trying to grow. Everyone's trying to get better at it. But in you have a society where they're trying to keep old, sort of barbaric, I say, but sort of lopsided ways of looking at society. That creates a problem, whether it's a specific law or just a culture. Like we say, Israel just released prisoners. So they said, you want women and children, and we want women and children. Right? Who are these children that they released? Right? These are teenagers who committed crimes, but terrible crimes, like they stabbed someone. And the question is, how does a teenager do that? I've got teenagers. Thank goodness they haven't stabbed anyone. How come their teenagers are stabbing someone? Right? The answer, and think about it in America. Unfortunately, there are teenagers stabbing people. But how does that happen? It happens because you raise your kid in a way where that was something that's within the accepted normal. And, and and that's a problem. That's a problem when you have 14-year-olds who will kill because they've been raised ever since they were little children. It's a great accomplishment in the sense of pride. It's a very, very big problem. Okay, going back to the chat here. What is the opinion of the fact that Israel as a civil state is losing the information warfare? Should we fight the information warfare? The bombing of the hospital, etc. I'll say like this. Honestly, the whole information warfare is a joke. It's a joke. Because people screaming and shouting does nothing. It's a lot of noise. Now, what it does is the media is part of that anti-Semitic machine, which comes from the intelligentsia of the United States. That's a machine. I don't think we can really fight it like that. But what I'm saying is, it doesn't really matter that much. The media, it only matters because we as humanity have turned that into a battleground. If they would tell all their stories and just say what they want, and we wouldn't counterpoint, yeah, it's true. A lot more people would be on the Palestinian side if we don't play that game. But we're not accomplishing anything with that game. At best, you're holding back people from overreacting. I think we spend too much effort worrying about what people think, and I think we should spend a little bit more of that energy into maybe correcting the way we think and the way we see things. Again, am I saying it's not important? It's important when someone doesn't know something. It's important to correct them. But let me say it better. The people who you want should listen to you when you're explaining yourself via media, those people aren't listening to you. So you're preaching to the choir, and both sides are preaching to the choir. Okay, let me move on to the next question. How can American universities correct this disinformation being spread to our young students? The truth is, I can't say this strongly enough. American universities, and maybe the world's universities, are no longer what a university used to be. A university used to be a place where they would gather the greatest minds of the generation, and it was the job of the greatest minds of the generation to train the next generation's greatest minds. Instead, it became a place for developing theories and ideas and then pushing them. And I'm not just saying that because they're pushing ideas that I don't agree with. I'm saying they've been pushing ideas for a long time, and what universities can do, we can try to fight a little bit in universities. Certainly it's been done through financial support, where we can approach universities and essentially insist. But again, what I say is it doesn't really matter. Up until 10 years ago, all that anti-Semitism was there, but they didn't really get a chance to say it out loud. They didn't really have the excuse for people to act out in that way. And that's unfortunate that it would get to this place. I don't think we can undo the information. And again, I think that this is trying to undo anti-Semitism. As we said, anti-Semitism exists, and we have to accept it for what it is, and we can approach it in different ways, but we can't simply talk our way. You can't stand up in front of the world and speak, and the world go, oh, if only we would have known, we wouldn't have hated the Jews so much. And it's not because we haven't tried, because everyone's had this idea. Everyone. I'm going to write a book. I'm going to explain Judaism and give it to all the Gentiles, and they will understand. The Gentiles read the book. They found the 5 lines that they could use against the Jews, and that was it, right? That's not how we believe we will overcome anti-Semitism. What we believe, that anti-Semitism exists in the world, and as long as we as Jews can get along, as long as we are doing certain things, it will continue to be a problem for us.
Well,
Okay.
so I will use this moment of relative quiet and questions, and then I will follow up with the question that I had in my mind. So far, what I'm hearing that we can't really fight the media because they are like too evil and too powerful. We can't really find universities because again they became too evil and too powerful. So then question, I mean, what can we do? What in your opinion the path forward?
So that's what I'm saying. The hope of the Jewish people. We are not hoping that this will be resolved by a lecture. We don't believe it's going to be resolved by a flyer. We don't believe it's going to be resolved by a gathering. Even let me say something for a second. We had 300,000 Jews in Washington, right? You're all familiar with this? How many incidences of violence were there?
I've been there, haven't seen none.
Zero. 300,000 people gather without a single incident of violence. The other side can't gather 4 people without blowing something up. Right? The world sees this. Did anyone see that episode on CNN where they talked about how wonderful the Jewish gathering was? I didn't either. Right? It wasn't there. I'm not picking on CNN. I just pick a random news station. But the point is that we cannot, there isn't anything in this world that we can hold up. You can rent out all the planes and fly them, make all the words. Jews are nice, Jews are kind. It's not going to change the perspective of people who hate the Jews because their hatred isn't based on a logic. The blood libel is not logical. And like I'm saying in today's class, I hope it was clear enough, the Palestinian story is not logical. It's not logical. It's just the story that you tell, and you say it over and over again, and you use it as an opportunity to attack the Jewish people. And that's, if we recognize that for what it is, at least we can see the monster we're facing. And at that point, we have to say to ourselves, okay, how do we overcome anti-Semitism in general? It's not through the media. We believe, like I said before, it's in one of 3 ways. Either the Messiah comes, some great person who's going to, in a supernatural way, affect the world and kind of wake the world up and say, can we please stop fighting? And everyone will stop fighting. That would be great. But in the interim, we believe there are only 2 paths. Either we make ourselves such good people that we create a positive vibe about us that will affect the level of the way people hate us, or we believe, like I said before, if we can get along better with each other, that lowers the animosity of outsiders towards us when we on the inside lower our animosity towards each other. That's our tradition, and that's what we believe. That's really the only way. And if you think about this, this isn't just a religious idea. If you walk around in your life as a person who hates nobody, if you can make yourself that kind of person, and people say, what about, I don't hate Palestinians, you shouldn't hate anyone. You say, who do you hate? You know what? You want to hate someone? Find an Amaleki, find some guy who wants, I hate those terrorists. Those terrorists, I hate them. But like I was saying to someone here, save your hatred. Save that word. If you can live your life as a person who walks around not hating, but loving people who are different than you, loving people who believe different than you, loving people who act different than you cause the world to become a better and more loving place. That is what our tradition is. And more so, if you love your family, you're supposed to have greater love towards your family than you have towards strangers. And so you should have a greater love towards your family of Jews than you have towards non-Jews. But it doesn't mean you don't love everyone. Everyone's a creation of God. Every human being was created b'tzelem Elokim, in the image of God. When you see a human being, it's supposed to remind you of God. And if this being is supposed to remind you of God, unless he turns himself into a monster, which humans are capable of doing, but until that, you have to feel a positive. And if you feel positive towards people, you will actually cause the whole world to become better. You will cause the people around you. Try this. Walk into a room and smile, and people will smile more. You walk into a room and you feel good. If you walk into a room, even if you don't say anything, but if you're angry, you create an angry energy there, and that that can have negative effects. We believe, again, I'm saying this from a sort of emotional, psychological perspective, but we believe it's deeper than that in the traditional, in a religious way. We believe that ahavat chinam, baseless love between Jews, spills over. It spills over and will give us a greater love between us and the nations as well. But it's got to start between us. And like I say to people, it's got to start with me. It has to start with me. Every person has to say it starts with me. And if every person would start with themselves and try to make themselves into the best person that they can be, the whole world would change. You have to believe that. You know, we believe, the Talmud tells us that Chayev Adam Lomar, every person has to say, Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam, the world was created for me. You know what that means? You know what that means when our sages say? Our sages are telling us, this is in the Talmud, that every person has to say, if God would only have had one person to create, and that was me, every person here has to say this. He would have created the world just for me. And we don't realize how important we are. And I think that if every person realizes the effect that they can have on the world, just from the way that they interact day by day, this is the way we believe that the world will actually be changed, each person at a time. Okay.
Thank you. If you don't mind, last question for me. So you proposed three solutions, but neither of these solutions mention IDF or, you know, the fight that Israel fights now on the tactical level. So my question, like, shall we actively try to help, you know, State of Israel in, as a friend of mine says, information war, you know, donating money to IDF, going to these demonstrations that even though they might not be actionable, but at least, you know, you express the support. I mean, as a Jewish people, and not even Jewish people, but all the people of goodwill that want to help in this fight against terrorists, and they might not be religious at the moment. I mean, do you see the value in, like, I understand that there is a religious component to, you know, to the fight, but meanwhile, shall we do?
Let me make a point. Let me make a point. This is a very important question. I think it's very important for everyone to hear this. In this situation, where people are saying, well, look what the Israelis did to the Palestinians, and that's what the Palestinians are doing to the Israelis. That is a crime of a statement. Because there is a concept of war. There's a concept of war. And there's rules of war. And then there's terrorism. And there's barbaric acts that are beneath any human being to behave. And anyone who confuses what happened early October with the Jews with any kind of war is evil. Because I don't care who you're fighting, you do not invade and attack women and children sitting in their homes, even men. These aren't soldiers. You don't attack a festival and take young teenagers, and I can't even speak the words of what they did to them. That's not in anyone's book of what's okay. And there is no religion in the world that actually justifies treating human beings like that. It doesn't exist. I'm familiar with lots of religions, and none of them say that you should behave in a way. There are people who are shown footage and they vomit. And that's good, because you should vomit when you see things like that. What was done to the Jews, the entire world, 8 billion people, should have stood up and kicked Hamas. You don't do that. We agreed 100 years ago, after we saw what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. We said, we can't allow this. We made rules about how we treat prisoners and hostages. Every rule was broken. No human being should put up with that. And certainly we as Jews don't have to put up with that. Now, the question is, what's the right response? Let's debate for hours. But a response needs to be taken, because you know what? The world didn't respond. You know when the world responded? You know when the world responded? When we attacked back. Suddenly, people marching in the streets. Where were the people marching in the streets when innocent babies babies, right? Where were they? This whole thing, and so I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional, but back to your question, what the Jews are doing now is the right of every human being to defend itself. And so this isn't a religious question. What's happening right now is something has to be done to stop Hamas from doing this kind of thing again. Like I said, even if you weren't a Jew, even if you're just, some man living in Madagascar, you should say to yourself, how can I make sure that such a thing doesn't happen anywhere in the world? And so the Jews are doing what they should do, and we should certainly. Now, Jews are in trouble. They need money. The Jews in Israel always need money. That's good. The Jews in America also need money, right? So it's always good to help people who are in need, and certainly financially. Spiritually, yes, we need to pray for our fellow Jews, and we need to feel concerned. Someone said to me, early on, they said, I don't feel like I can do anything. What can I do? So I said to them, here's what you can do right now. Care. Just care. Because when you care, it'll turn into something. You'll figure out something will come up. But just care. You just have to care. You have to feel pain. You have to feel pain when this happens to any human being, and when it happens to our brothers and sisters, it's more painful. You feel the pain more. So we need to do something. Is what we're doing the best thing that could be done? Honestly, I don't have all the information. So if I had all the information, I can make a judgment whether the current. I think a lot of people, everyone likes to sit in their couch at home and say, if I was running this country, here's what I would do. If I was running this war, here's what I would do. And I'll tell you, if someone would give me all the information and present it, I'd be happy to give my opinion on how they should run this war. But unfortunately, no one elected me. No one gave me this job, and I'm probably better off not having this position. But there is a person who's in charge of this. He was elected by the Israelis, and part of that electing someone is to trust that person, that if your safety and danger is in. And so the Jews have chosen not a religious figure, they've picked an individual, and so we kind of have to support him, because what he's trying to do is keep Jews safe. But I don't need to turn him into a religious figure in order for me to support the mission that he's on. And again, let me make this clear. He's not following the Torah, so I wouldn't take this approach. I would take the approach that follows the Torah. But nevertheless, he's a Jew who's fighting along with other Jews for the safety of our people. And I think all of us, whether Jew or non-Jew, needs to support any nation's right to exist in a peaceful way.
Thank you so much. So I think that we've done a lot. So probably, if
Okay.
anybody has more questions, and it's time to probably run. Yeah.
Okay. So unless there's a further question, I'll just give a final thought. Okay. So just the final thought. I want to end in a very positive way. I know it's very hard to picture this, but give me a chance here. I think it's important for us to realize, I believe, and this is what Jews believe, that whatever happens in the world, we don't understand why this happens or why that happens. But we do know that there is a reason, that there is one above who does understand. There is a system. And Job says to God, he says, explain to me, why am I suffering this way? And God says to him, listen, if I could explain it to you, I would. But the calculations are so complicated that we'd be here the rest of your life just discussing the calculations. The point is, I don't need to understand the mind of God. I can't. I'm not, the system of the way the world works, I can't even figure out, what a molecule of water is. Am I going to understand what right and wrong is in terms of who deserves what? I don't have that problem, but I do want to know the reasons for why things are happening. But I'm okay when there are things that I don't understand to say, but God does understand. And if you believe that there is evil in the world that can cause destruction, you have to believe that the good in the world can cause construction. If you believe that there are evil people in the world who can bring down not just themselves, but they brought down humanity, they dragged millions of people with them into hate, into anger, into rage, into murder, you also have to believe that there's holiness in the world that can bring people closer to love and understanding and care amongst all of mankind. You have to believe in the good. You have to believe in the good within yourself. You have to believe in the good within mankind. It's there. And I don't mean this in a kumbaya kind of let's sit around the campfire singing songs I'm not deluded into thinking that we can just snap our fingers and the world will become a better place. But what I do believe is that is where the world is going. The world will reach a better place. Humanity is constantly growing by divine support. The world will become better eventually. We just have to hope that we can speed up this process step by step in the way that we better ourselves and the world around us. And eventually we will bring a fixing to the entire world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the great lecture and for your time. Thank you. I will be, if you want to recording, please contact me. I will be distributing the recording after the lecture. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.